Welcome to SCR Connection. Thank you everyone for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers, Sarah Towner Wright and Jennifer Walker Bissram. As the head clinical and statewide engagement, Sarah strategizes and leads clinical engagement opportunities, manage statewide health initiatives based at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Health Science Library, and serves as the primary provider of library support for the School of Medicine. Jennifer is a health sciences librarian and liaison to the Adams School of Dentistry at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Jennifer is the primary contact and provider of library support for the Adams School of Dentistry by collaborating with faculty to provide curriculum integrated instructions in the area of evidence-based dentistry, conducting expert literature searches, and participating in the scholarship of teaching and learning. In today's SCR Connection, Sarah and Jennifer will tell us about changing the way we approach systematic reviews through education, automation, and machine learning tools. Thank you, Sarah and Jennifer, for being our guest speakers this morning. And I will turn everything over to you.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Sarah Wright, and I'm the head of clinical and statewide engagement at the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill Health Sciences Library. And my co-presenter today is Jennifer Walker Bissram, who is our liaison to the School of Dentistry. So the first thing we want to do today is go over our objectives and the agenda for today. We'll be discussing criteria for setting up an institutional systematic review service at an academic library. We're managing expectations and questions from our users regarding the systematic review process. And then Jennifer is going to discuss and explain how machine learning solutions can enhance your automation of systematic reviews and other literature, complex literature searches, and discuss real-world applications of how this technology has been used successfully by medical librarians. So the first thing I want to do is conduct a short poll regarding your expertise and knowledge of systematic reviews and machine learning in systematic reviews. So Edward, is that ready to go?
Yes, let me take the ball back.
Thank you. So there are three quick questions that we wanted to get your responses for. And the first one is how many systematic reviews you've worked on? What are the biggest roadblocks you have in the systematic review process or providing systematic review services to your user? And finally, have you used any machine learning or automation tools in the past? So if you could just take maybe 30, 40 seconds to answer these three questions, just so that we have a better idea of where you are in the process of providing systematic review services. All right, about 10 more seconds, and then we're going to close the poll and look at the results. All right, Edward, if you can go ahead and we can look at those results.
Okay, closing the poll in 15 seconds.
Thank you. All right, so Some of you have not completed any systematic review support so far, and that's great. And I'm hoping that this session will kind of give you some advice moving forward with your systematic review teams, and some of you have done quite a few systematic reviews. In terms of roadblocks, time commitment and knowledge, and that's exactly how I think a lot of people feel, and even some of us who've been doing systematic reviews for years, there are always new issues that arise with our systematic review teams, and not having the time to commit to these projects. And then training, and then great. And then 56% of you have not used, or have actually 20% of you have used machine learning tools and systematic reviews, and the rest of you haven't. So that's great. So I'm hoping you can come away after today's session with some knowledge about the systematic review support process and also about machine learning. So at UNC-Chapel Hill, we provide systematic review services for 2 groups, and the services that we provide for those 2 groups are different. So first we have, of course, the standard research teams and groups, faculty members, researchers who are looking to publish results of a systematic review in a journal and publishing an actual article. And then secondly, we also have multiple groups of students who are taking systematic review classes. And 2 of our large groups are, there's a Master's of Public Health Systematic Review class, and also the nursing PhD students. And also some of our master's students for their thesis will do systematic review as part of it. And they're really looking at what we call a systematized review, which is a protocol development and practice, but maybe not going through multiple databases. They only have one screener for the process, and it is a smaller project, of course, than one that would be published. And then last year, UNC also offered a meta-analysis class through the School of Journalism. And there were about 30 students in that class, and they actually did a limited data analysis along with the systematized review. So with all of these classes and all of our researchers requesting systematic review services, we started a couple years ago looking at how we can provide services to these groups at an institutional level with multiple librarians working on systematic reviews. We needed to be able to keep track of them, see how many systematic reviews each librarian was working on at one time, and then also being able to gather statistics for these groups. So we created a systematic review request form through Google that we ask each person complete before they meet with us to do their systematic review. And the next 3 slides are going to show you some of the questions that we ask on our systematic review form that could be tailored to any institution, any group. And we are looking at, first of all, is this for publication or for course assignment? And this is very different for us in terms of, if it's a course assignment, the amount of time we spend helping them, knowing that it's not going to be a full systematic review process that we need to go through versus the publication. We want them to write down their focus, the subject of their systematic review before they meet with us, and if they can turn it into a clinical question that their systematic review will be answering, that's also important for us so that we can do some work prior to meeting with them to know kind of what's out there in terms of the literature. If it's well, actually, there's a systematic review done on this topic last year. Have you seen this? Or I did a quick search and I found 3 articles, or I did a quick search and I found 10,000 articles. So it helps us be able to gauge the amount of work with this team and what they are going to need from us in terms of services. And then what initial searching they have done on their end and terms and databases that they have used. Again, we've asked them if there's already a systematic review that's been published on this topic, and how will your topic improve what has already been done in research in this area. We asked them to give us 2 articles that they feel are relevant, and then this kind of helps us decide, you know, the focus that they're looking for in their systematic review versus the clinical question or the focus that they gave us on that page before on the question. And then number 12, what is the estimated timeline for completion of the systematic review? We use this to gauge a couple things: how knowledgeable they are about the systematic review process. We'll have people who send this back and they say, I want to have it done by the end of the month, versus I want to have it done in a year. So we kind of know where they are in the process. And then finally, 3 more questions. Are there other people working in your group? If they say no, then we know that we need to educate them on the systematic review process and the screening and how many people need to be involved in the process, what citation manager they're planning to use, and then finally, if they're going to be using Covidence to screen the results. At UNC, we do have an institutional subscription to Covidence, which we use for almost all of our systematic review teams to go through the screening process. And then we also need to do training on Covidence as we go, as we work with our teams. When we work with our teams at that first meeting after they've completed the form and we meet with either one person or the whole team, we have this tiered services handout that we give to them kind of to discuss where they are expecting the services of the health sciences librarian to work with their team. And we've got the tier 1 services and the tier 2 services. And when I look at tier 1 services, I see words like guidance and help and instruction and training. So we'll work with them to help them with their search strategies, to work with them through the process, but we are not running the searches, being a member of the team, etc. And then we have our tier 2 services, which I kind of call the Cadillac services, where we are involved as a review team member, and we do request for co-authorship up front as we work with these groups. We run the searches for them, we deduplicate, we test the search strategy, we put the information, the citations into Covidence for them, help them with the full text, help them with their Prisma flow chart, and then also writing the section, the methods section dealing with the literature search. So kind of as a tier 2 service, we really are totally involved with the group throughout the whole process. We started collecting statistics when we introduced this new form back in 2018, and again, this helps us keep our statistics up to date. And in 2.5 years, we've had over 230 systematic review consult request forms, 140 from students, and I'm sure it's over 90 because sometimes our requests do not get into the system, but they're done with us locally. So we have over 100, of which 30 of these have been actually published. We require that the requester complete the form before we meet with them so we can do some prep work and also know where they are in the process. And then when we meet with them, we review the information and start creating the protocol based on their clinical question. In that initial consult appointment, we kind of start figuring out, laying out how we're going to proceed with the literature searches, discussing the review question, the subject headings that we would use and search terms, what databases we're going to use. A big question is also, are you looking at just peer-reviewed articles, or are you looking at gray literature, conference abstracts, papers, posters, and what information and data that would bring into the systematic review results, publication dates, other limits, and really what is their timeline for completing their review. So once we've gotten to that point, we'll start working with the teams throughout the systematic review process. And in the past 2.5 years, of which we usually have 5 librarians who support the systematic review process at UNC, I've kind of come up with this list of 10 common questions I get from systematic review groups and my answers to those groups. So the first question is, why do I need to have 2 screeners for my systematic review? Why can't I just screen and choose articles by myself? And of course, then you go through the systematic review process and why you're using 2 screeners to eliminate bias, to look at your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then this is the blurb from the Cochrane Training Handbook about 2 people working independently to determine the studies based on their eligibility criteria. And I sometimes have pushback from groups, and I pull this out and explain to them why they need 2. Then sometimes it goes in the other angle of, sometimes I'll have groups that'll have up to 10 screeners. And the problems that we have with so many multiple screeners, I usually ask groups get together, if it's 2 screeners or 10 screeners, and screen the first 15 or 20 articles together so that there's less of a risk of conflict and they can talk about the inclusion exclusion criteria and everyone get on the same page as they start the screening process. Question 2, how long will it take me to screen articles and write the review? So on average, based on literature I found in the past, screeners can screen up to 75 to 90 titles or abstracts per hour. And again, that depends on the group, how informed they are on the topic and how quickly they can go through the screening process. And then letting them know that writing a systematic review, 6 months, kind of on the low end, the short end of time, up to 16 months. I've worked with a couple groups. I think we're going on year 4 now, and it's still not done, and they're still doing the data extraction. Number 3, why do I have to search multiple databases? So to systematically review the literature, the review needs to include multiple databases. Information from various databases will give you a broader and a fuller information scope of the topic, and helping groups choose a variety of databases like global health, or if it's an education topic, or using psych info if there's psychology, psychiatry involved in the topic, or using a general database such as Web of Scopus, or a database such as MBase, and figuring out what databases they should be using. How can I easily translate my PubMed searches into other databases? So when I work with my systematic review teams, I usually suggest that they complete their search strategy in PubMed completely, so that it is absolutely perfect with no changes, and then look at translating your search strategy into the other databases. Obviously, databases such as MBase or CINAHL, you have subject headings that are specific to those databases, and then there are other databases that you're just searching by text word and taking out those subject headings. I also show websites such as the Systematic Review Accelerator, where you can take your PubMed search, copy and paste it and put into here, and then choose the other databases where it will translate your search strategy into those other databases. I always tell the folks I'm working with to double check the subject headings, as they do not always translate correctly. So going into MBase and finding the subject headings to make sure that they have been accurately translated. But it does save some time to use one of these tools to translate your search. Next, I always get pushback about, well, why can't I just use the past 5 years to reduce the number of results, or just 2 years? And I always talk to people about finding a meaningful date. So a meaningful date to me is choosing a date that would be discussed in the method section of the paper, that we started with this date because there was a date of a policy, a date a new drug was introduced. I'm looking at everything in the future beyond a very important article that was written in such and such a year, or a government report came out this year, or I want to do everything since a previous systematic review was published in 2015. So I'll tell the group then to go back to 2014, since obviously there's that lag of time between doing the research and publication. Number 6, why do I need to have inclusion-exclusion criteria created before I start the screening process? So obviously, to reduce the risk of bias, the researcher will need to clearly define the criteria. And then that criteria will be used to decide whether an article will be considered irrelevant, or whether it will move on to full text screening. And then if criteria are not being used and relevant articles are chosen by the authors as they see fit, then you're really not conducting a true systematic review. That's more of a literature review, a narrative review, where the author is choosing the articles they want included. Number 7, where should I register my systematic review? If you notice, a lot of publishers now for systematic reviews are asking for that protocol registration information to be included in the article. And here are 4 places where you can register your systematic review: Prospero, Campbell and Cochrane Collaborations, and the Open Science Registry. Prospero at this point, last time I checked, is about 3 to 6 months behind in registering the systematic reviews. So that's something to keep in mind. But then you do have that registration number with Prospero that can then be included in your systematic review. Number 8, how do I know what has to be included in my systematic review or a scoping review? So the PRISMA checklist is a great place to have your groups go to really look at all the checklist items and where it's reported in their article. There is a 2020 PRISMA checklist update that is available. And then there is also a PRISMA checklist for scoping reviews too that I've given to my groups if they're doing a scoping review instead of a systematic review. Next, how long is it going to take me to write our systematic review? So my answer to this question is to start at the end. What is your end date where you want to send the information to the publisher, and then work backwards? So if someone tells me that they have a year to do this process, I usually tell them, okay, I would use the last 3 months then to write the article, unless they think that they can turn that around sooner, and then go back and say maybe 2 weeks for the quality assessment and the data extraction. And then for the title and abstract screening, obviously it's going to take a shorter amount of time if you have 100 articles to screen versus 4,000. And how many hours the screeners can dedicate to this project really will then help decide on the timeline and keeping track of when they should be starting a new section and working with the groups to say, hey, you know, it's been a month and you were supposed to have your title abstract screening done in 2 weeks. Do we need to change the timeline, or can we really get this moving? And of course, you know, with every group, things change, deadlines are not met. And, you know, we all work through that as needed with our teams. And the other thing I like in Covidence, when we do when we use Covidence in our teams, we can actually track how many titles abstract screening each person has done. So I can go back then and say, hey, John, I see that you've only done 30 out of your 2,000 and it's due next week. So kind of helping the team along with meeting those goals and those deadlines. And then finally, where should I publish my systematic review? And obviously doing a literature search in databases and finding journals where topics have been published previously. And then also, if you aren't familiar with JANE, which is the Journal Author Name Estimator, you can put your title, your subject of your article, and then it will give you a list of journals that have published using your title words. And people seem very happy with using this as a tool to help them find a journal to publish. When I work with a systematic review team, usually at the first or second meeting, I ask them, do you know what journals you're looking at for publication? And I ask them that because I ask them to then go to the journal, look at the author information, look at the guidelines for systematic reviews, how the journal handles systematic reviews. Can they only be a Cochrane review? Are they by invitation only? How many references can you have? What is the page limit? So that they kind of have that information in advance, so that they're writing their article and preparing that at a place where it can then be published in the journal or other journals that they would like to publish their articles in. All right, so I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Jennifer, to talk about machine learning. And when she is done, we will go back then and answer your questions that have come in through the chat. And I've seen a couple things come in so far, and we will work through those at that point.
Thanks, Sarah. And can you hear me okay? Thumbs up?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. And just to let you know, I've addressed, I think, most of the questions that have come in through the chat, but if you see anything extra that comes in or you want to comment further, please feel free to jump in, Sarah. So I'm Jennifer Walker Bissram, and I'm going to kind of pivot from Sarah's presentation a little bit and talk about machine learning for large-scale literature reviews. So this can either be with regards to systematic reviews or scoping reviews, or just, as the title implies, literature reviews where you're getting thousands and tens of thousands of results. And so the whole session, this part of the session is really about raising awareness of machine learning and automation in this application. And some of you indicated that you have used machine learning or AI for different applications for your work earlier when we had the poll up. So I'm curious, for those who did answer that they use this in their work, can you put in the chat for me like what you've used or how you've applied it? And while we're kind of waiting for some of those people to chime in, again, I just want to point out that this is about raising awareness. And so I think for a lot of you, this may be new. And so it'll give you something to think about, like how you might pursue this within your own institution, or when it comes to evaluating some software that you may be interested in, what, you might hear some key terms that will kind of help you dig in a little bit further. Okay, so Ryan, for predictive evaluation of titles and abstracts, great. I'm glad you had that experience, Kate. And PubMed Reminder. Okay. Covidence, okay. Some distiller SR users. Bird scraper, Voyant tools. Okay, so we have a variety of things in here. That's pretty cool. So let me just kind of move forward here. Okay, so some of the text analytics approaches that I'm going to talk to you about today. I'll talk about clustering, which is here on the left. It's a fully unsupervised method. And then we move to the right side of the spectrum. I'm also going to talk about supervised clustering, actually is to the right of that, which is probably a little less familiar to you guys. And then I'll talk about machine learning, which you're probably familiar with in other applications, but we're going to talk about how it's applied to the literature. And the fully supervised method requires training data, so that makes things a little more complex in that manner. So unsupervised clustering, at a glance, we would do it on a set of search results. We do it specifically on titles and abstracts, so what we can pull out of PubMed or Scopus or Web of Science. And the algorithms that we typically use are k-means. You can also use non-negative matrix factorization, or NMF, and LDA, or those are the popular ones, but there are other clustering algorithms out there. And these are publicly available too, and some of them are quite old. Actually, k-means, I think, has been around for a couple of decades. So it isn't particularly cutting edge technology, and it's been around in the literature, but the application of it in this area is still fairly new, just because there really hasn't been a lot of uptake in it. That's actually been quite slow, partly because there aren't free tools available or low-cost tools that are available. Some of you have talked about using Distiller, and then also just kind of a lack of expertise really within libraries and library staff. So I think of clustering as kind of a refine and shine approach, and so we can use it to refine the search strategy. We can use it kind of like shine like a flashlight in the corners of our search results. So maybe you do sort of a test search and you're like, well, I'm not sure if we're getting what we expect to be getting. So we run it through clustering, and really quickly we have a tool for that. I guess I'll give a background in a moment of where that tool came from. It takes maybe a minute or so, and we can run it on 50,000 results. So it's a fairly quick process. The benefits of clustering is that there's no training data is required, and that's actually a big benefit. So it means I can just take my search results, run them right through the algorithm. It doesn't give you quantifiable quantifiable predictions of recall. And so recall is a measure of how many of the relevant studies we've captured. And with the other methods I'll talk about, we can actually get a prediction of recall. So we can say that predict that we're going to capture 90 or 95% of the relevant studies with clustering. With clustering, we don't get that. It's a little bit more subjective, and I'll show you here an example of what that looks like in a moment. But I guess just a little bit of background about the tools that we use. These come to us from our department head. I've been working with her a little bit over a year on some of these automation tools. She came to us a couple of years ago from a management consulting firm. And the tools that she used were developed in-house. And that group was not really interested in moving it forward into any sort of commercially available product. And so when she left that company, she brought those tools to UNC. And so now we're kind of learning this, learning the process, learning the tools along the way. Okay, so let's take a look at kind of what this looks like, what I just described as far as clustering. And unfortunately, the things are not kind of going through the transition process. Okay, so anyway, looking at the panel on the left. So we have our search results. If you picture each of these dots being a different study results, each color being a different topic. In the middle panel, I run my clustering algorithm, and it looks for similarities in the text based on the titles and abstracts. And it groups like things with like things. And so we see on the far right then, we have a cluster then of things that are more likely to be relevant based on this keyword signature that they have. And so our output then gives us kind of a keyword summary, and I'll show you what that means in a moment. And this is a fairly simple visualization, but I find that it helps. And when I was first learning about this, these visualizations really did help. So, darn, I wish these would show a little bit better. Okay, so our research question for this particular output example is, how do feral cat populations affect the environment and humans? So the first column is our cluster number, 0 to 9. So we generally start with 10 clusters. It's kind of a nice even number, but this is user driven. So depending on a number of factors, you can change that, the number of clusters. And then the second column is the number of studies that falls within the cluster. And one study can only fall in one cluster. And then the third column is the keywords that kind of pop out, or the topic signature. And I pulled two of them out, cluster 2 and cluster 9. So based on any sort of knowledge that you may have about feral cat populations, if you were to choose between cluster 9 and cluster 2, you can just put in the chat what you think, which cluster would you prioritize to look at first if you were limited in resources. Okay. So I see a lot of people say cluster 9. I do see a couple of cluster 2s in there. Okay, so for those of you who responded, why did you choose your cluster, or why didn't you choose the other one? Feral cats. Okay. Social effects. How is environment defined? That would decide which cluster is for me. Okay. So for those that chose cluster 9, you see that feral is a word that's kind of at the beginning, cats. If you know anything about feral cats, that they are voracious predators of songbirds, which are, which can be kind of have an effect on the environment. Cluster number 2 talks about allergens and dust, and it has the word indoor in it. So those are more, to me, that would say that's more about indoor allergies and not so much environmental. But yeah, somebody did mention, like, how are you defining environment? And so this is where there is some subjectivity involved. And I wouldn't necessarily be making these decisions. You as librarians would not necessarily be making these decisions as to which cluster we would perhaps take a look at or likewise omit from screening. This is something that we would present to the research team and ask them to weigh in on. So that is one approach to clustering. Again, it does take, like I said, it does take a little bit of subject matter knowledge. Sometimes, depending on how well you know the subject, it does line up with what the experts in the research team choose. Okay, so next one we have is supervised clustering. This would be kind of the next level up. And if you remember back to that graphic with the tools, this one did have some input, meaning that it does require some training data. Supervised clustering, I don't think is a term that you're really going to see widely in the literature. It's in some papers. It's a form of semi-supervised machine learning. And the underlying approach really is the same as clustering, meaning that we're going to be using the same algorithms. We're going to be putting titles and abstracts in through pretty much the same methodology. The difference this time, though, is we're going to use seeds. That's why there's a dandelion in the background here. And we're going to take these seeds that are known relevant studies, and we're going to follow them and see where they land and use that to make our decision about where to look. And so this approach, it becomes a little less subjective and more quantifiable to select which studies to review. So although it does require training data in the form of seeds, it's relatively little. It's much less than what would be required for machine learning. And this form only requires positive studies or positive seeds. Machine learning requires both positive and negative. Negative studies aren't hard to come by, of course. We encounter those a lot, and they're usually in abundance. And excuse me, I can probably get away with about 25 to 50 positive seeds. But this method is quantitative, and it does take some of the guesswork out of which clusters to review. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. Okay, so. All right, so visualizing supervised clustering, we have our seeds that we've identified are positive seeds, and ideally we would get those randomly. So we have our, I would take my literature search results, take batches of maybe 200, 250 studies, ask the research team to select those, review them, tell me which ones are relevant, which ones of these that are, yes, this is what I would find, these are the studies that I'm looking for. And then in that case, they become kind of like a magnet that allows me to say, okay, the ones that I know are relevant, I'm going to follow them and find out what landed near them. And so, again, this graphic kind of shows that we have our seed studies and that we put in with our search results. In the first panel, they cluster in the middle panel, and in the last panel, we see kind of what sticks together. And we would review those high priority clusters based on the percent of seed studies that land within them. And so I guess taking our same example and moving it forward. So, okay, so same example we had before with the feral cat populations. I've added a column to this output. So I have my cluster number, the number of studies, and now I have the percent of seeds. So it means that I don't necessarily have to rely totally on these keywords, which, as we're pointed out in the chat, are a little imperfect. So I can use this to kind of back up what I suspect. We suspected that cluster 9 looked good, and 58% of my seed studies are here. So actually now I feel pretty good about that. And I'm going to start with those, roughly 2,900 studies as far as reviewing them. Cluster number 2, we kind of said we didn't really like that cluster. Probably it's about domestic cats and allergies. So I could probably safely omit those 357 studies. Now, that's not a lot, so maybe that's not actually so great at reducing those studies to review, but they add up. So if you omit some of the other, like cluster number 4, we're lopping off another 436 or so. But this also helps me. I can also potentially look at other clusters that may not have jumped out as being interesting based on their keywords. So cluster 0, that has our second highest percentage of seeds landed in there. So that would be, that cluster might be of interest to review. And so that's kind of how I would go forward with that. Okay. So I'll just kind of briefly talk about machine learning too, and the different algorithms. So this is a fully supervised method, meaning it takes a full set of training data. In this case, I'm going to need like several hundred positive seed studies, and I do need some negative studies too, but those, like I said, those aren't very hard to come by. We can typically get those pretty easily. Again, some different algorithms, naive Bayes, support vector machines. Those are some that are used. You can also have active or passive training. You may have heard of active machine learning. It's kind of, sort of been a hot topic, and I think that's what Ryan uses, and maybe Distiller as well. And it's basically kind of an ongoing training. And then passive is the decision has already been made. They've already been classified as positive or negative. And honestly, I think passive training has kind of been regarded as a little bit more of a precise method, meaning I'll get fewer false positives on that. And there's literature out there that supports that. Then I also get data on each individual study. In supervised clustering, I'm going to get, like we talked about in supervised clustering, I'm getting data on the buckets of the studies, the clusters. And that's going to lead me to which bucket of studies is, review these, this large number. So we look at these 2,900, we omit 3,000. And so it's, again, it's about based on the clusters. Here I'm actually going to get a probability score for each individual study, and then I can order them by probability score, and I can review them in order. And there's kind of there's a big drop-off point, a big cliff, if you will, where I'm not getting any relevant studies for like a couple of rounds. I've reviewed several hundred, and then just none of them are relevant. So at that point, it kind of becomes a decision point for the research team. They continue moving forward, or do they say, okay, I'm pretty confident that we got 90 or 95% of the relevant studies. I'm not going to put any more resources into this. So the challenge is that, it does require training data, and that's pretty time intensive to create. And so we usually start with supervised clustering in our library, and then we can pivot to machine learning if we need to. Because once I've reviewed a good amount of studies, now I actually have a training data set that's created. So I'm not really going to talk anymore about active machine learning predictions and stuff like that, or just machine learning in general. There's a lot of published work on that, and I think that just gets a little too messy to talk about in a session here, where it's more about raising awareness. So let's just go through the visualization of this. It's a little bit different, but it still has a similar idea. In this case, I have my unclassified studies, and I have training data. I have a set of positive studies and a set of negative studies, and they get fed into the model, to the algorithm. And I'm going to get, like I said, predictions by the study level. And so then I choose a point where I'm going to hopefully, I don't know if you can see my mouse, probably, maybe about halfway down or so on the second panel there. So I have the blue studies that are relevant, the green studies that are not relevant. I'll pick a point on here where I would review, maybe it's 0.5, anything with a probability score of 0.5 or above, I'm going to review those studies. Of course, I'm going to get some noise in the form of these green studies that I would still review that are not relevant. And it'll probably be more than just a couple, but again, it's a simple visualization. And then we really want to minimize the false negatives. So those would be the positive relevant studies that I don't capture because the algorithm would mark them as not relevant. Again, we usually work in the range of 90 to 95%. So, I mean, it's pretty much impossible to get at 100%. So we kind of have to feel comfortable with a threshold of 90 to 95%. Which I know is scary to some people. It's like, we want to get them all, but, we just can't. But we are starting with a larger pool of studies than perhaps if we were using our traditional search methods where we're, putting on somewhat artificial limitations in order to get the total number of results down to something that's manageable. So just kind of a quick wrap up here. I think we're kind of getting close to time here, so we can take some questions. I see a lot of them coming in, and thanks, Sarah, for fielding those. So starting at the bottom, a keyword search strategy is typically what we use, what we're all familiar with, but it can create a good amount of noise. So, even a good search strategy, you might only get 10% that are relevant. And so it can be imprecise. We get a lot of noise, just, the English language is used in so many different ways. So then our next step up would be clustering. We have, again, it's unsupervised learning, no input required. We don't get any predictive metrics. That was our first example where we have to have a little bit of subject knowledge, and it's a little bit more subjective. And then supervised clustering, the next step up would require Cs, not very many. We do get some predictive metrics. And then the top of the pyramid here, we would, would be machine learning. Again, it's more precise. I get metrics at the individual study level, prediction of probability of being relevant. So that's kind of how it all stacks up in the scheme of things. I think I might have a few more slides left. Okay. Here's just a couple of projects that we've used where we've used machine learning and automation at UNC. The first one is actually one that I worked on. It's shoot, the whole thing didn't render because the animation. So basically, I was finding the harms in excipients or fillers in drugs, medications, and they're looking at a particular class of medications too, like opioids and benzos, and like four classes that are normally used, or not normally, but can be used, can be abused, basically. And so there's a whole lot of published literature out there about the harms of the active ingredients, like in opioids, but what are the harms in the excipients or the fillers that are used to bind these, and crush-resistant ones, and to keep them from melting down, and all sorts of barriers that try to prevent people from abusing these. We're looking at the harms of those types of fillers, and as you might imagine, like the association between the excipients and the harmful effects is difficult to tease out of a search when you're also when you also have the drug names in there, because it's more about the harmfulness of the drugs. So anyway, we applied some of these machine learning approaches, and our change in precision was about 8%, and you can see in the footnote then how that was calculated. But what we're really interested in is studies that were not screened manually and the time saved. So our algorithms indicated that there were over 4,500 that didn't need to be screened manually, saving the research team approximately 80 to 150 hours of time. And that's calculated, as you can see at the bottom there, 30 seconds on the low end for reviewing, a minute on the high end, times the number of studies times 2 reviewers. And then the other two, I guess, aren't rendering, and those time saved hours are actually much higher. They were just different projects, though, that I was not a part of. And then, I guess one last slide. So questions that I get of so when is it appropriate to use machine learning? Generally, we recommend searches with 3,000 or more results that would yield a measurable benefit. So if you're working with less than that, and it's not to say 3,000 is a hard number, but if you're having 800, 1,000, 1,200, something like that, there really isn't much benefit in using some of these clustering tools. They can be used, on various publication types, so scoping reviews, rapid reviews, systematic reviews. We have PhD students who are trying to figure out their dissertation topic. They have a broad topic in mind, but how do they hone in on that? We'll use just a quick unsupervised clustering and say, all right, well, here's the body of literature on this topic. Here are the different areas, and that kind of helps the students really figure out maybe where they want to home in on, how much literature is available to them. If they have a particularly maybe narrow concept, it's like, well, there's not a whole lot out there, so it gives them a little bit more information in which to make a decision. It's good for health-related topics too. Because we have evidence of efficacy primarily in health and medicine, and my examples were kind of like environmental sciences. And then also in low precision topics where you have just impossible concepts and search terms that are really messy, and you have a lot of significant false positives, those type of topics are good candidates for using this. So I think that is the end. Sorry, I'm a little over, but we still have a few more minutes for questions and answers. And if there's something in the chat that Sarah wasn't able to get, I'll try to go through and address them. So, Sarah, can you give me maybe a rundown of where we are?
Yes, so there are some questions regarding, let me pull up the chat again. Hold on. What are some available tools or products that correspond with each of these automation techniques? Would be one to address.
The only ones that I can think of right offhand, and I should have done a little bit more research on this prior to, because I know one of our colleagues, Sarah, did a presentation on this at MLA, exploring some of the tools that she found using the SR toolbox and evaluated them for these various automation steps. Unfortunately, I didn't pull that up ahead of time, but the only two that keep coming back to mind are Ryan and Distiller, and those are more on the machine learning aspect of this.
Another question, in a systematic review, don't you have to screen all results and not just the ones in a particular cluster?
Well, not necessarily. Like I said, you kind of have to be comfortable with getting at about 95% percent of relevant studies. I mean, sometimes you just don't have the resources to review all of the, 100% of the studies. In the feral cat example, I think there were close to 17,000 results, and the team just didn't have the resources to go through that. So this was a way to prioritize for them. If they wanted to eventually look at 100% of them, they could, but for their purposes, they needed to move on this quickly, and they were satisfied with honing in on particular clusters. I know for the excipient harm project that we're actually still working on, they fortunately they did want to review all of the studies, and that's how we were able to kind of get some of these metrics. We did the prioritization for them, and then just kind of for their own edification, they wanted to see if it was accurate or not, and it did prove to be pretty accurate. That they didn't need to go through and review 100%. That what the algorithms produced was sufficient.
And then one last question that's come up with a couple different people. If you use machine learning, how do you detail this in your methods section and the Prisma flowchart for your systematic review?
Oh, that's a good question. So I've actually been working on the methods for that particular project of excipient harms, and I've had my department head work on that with me. She's published in this area, Michelle Cawley. Some of you may be familiar with that name. She's published from with her previous company on these methods, and so she's helped me write a draft of that. The Prisma chart is a little different than the normal Prisma chart that you would see, but we do have it graphically laid out of kind of our the more like decision points, like, okay, we reviewed this many, we didn't review this number, and it's still a flow chart, but it's just not the traditional Prisma chart. And there's a few examples in the literature that I used to draw on when I was drafting the methods.
All right. Well,